Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session is about to begin.
Good almost afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. My name is Alex Martin, and I'm the Director of Strategic Forums here at Globsec. And it's my pleasure to invite the speaker of the next session, Dex Toreke Barton, the Director of Brunswick Group in London. He will have a chat, a Tatra talk actually, on backlash against the machine. He will talk for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will get a set of questions before we move into the last panel. Dex, stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be up on stage again. It's interesting that the title of this talk is Backlash Against the Machine. And from that title, you might assume I'm going to be a natural skeptic about all the impacts of technology. On the other hand, if anyone heard me in the previous sessions yesterday, you will know that I am a Silicon Valley person. I am a techno-optimist by nature. And I think actually the way that title of the talk was framed is actually an interesting and illustrative example of how, in many ways, Europe and America view the opportunities and the challenges of tech very, very differently. I'm going to try and change your mind a little bit about some of the natural skepticism that I know a lot of you in the room feel. Before I get started, I want to try a little experiment, and I haven't done this before, so we'll see how well this works out. This is a very serious, high-level gathering of folks, and I'm always interested in where people are getting their information and their inspiration. So I'd love a show of hands if you say that you read more fiction than non-fiction in general. Wow, okay, so that worked really, really well. Of those about 5 people who put their hands up, how many of you would say you read a lot of science fiction? That's actually more people than put your hands up the first time. Okay, apparently you thought science fiction was real, so that's good, which leads perfectly onto my next point, which is in Silicon Valley, we spend a lot of time both consuming fiction and consuming science fiction. And it's not because that group is any less serious than gatherings like this. It's because when we think of science fiction and the futures that are presented in works of science fiction, that is really just science fact before its time. Over and over again throughout history, we have seen in works of what was then considered zany and ludicrous predictions of the future, articles and kernels of truth that ended up massively disrupting our way of life within a few decades. And the way I'm going to walk through this topic, backlash against the machine, is actually, I'm going to talk about just 5 works of science fiction that I think have important lessons for us as policymakers and as leaders and as decision makers in the future as we deal with the challenges created by the machine. And at the very minimum, the massive number of you in the audience who have never picked up a work of science fiction recently or a work of fiction, you'll at least get some good speaker recommendations, even if you think the rest of my talk is complete nonsense. So let me tell you about 5 works of fiction that I love and that I recommend to anyone. The first is a book written by the British science fiction author H.G. Wells in 1938. It's called The World Brain. And many of you may know H.G. Wells from some of his fully science fiction writings. He wrote War of the Worlds, which has been adapted over and over again by Hollywood since they've run out of ideas for any new stories. What H.G. Wells actually spent most of his career doing was writing works that straddled the line between fiction and non-fiction, because what really motivated H.G. Wells was a vision of liberal internationalism. Back in the 1930s, there was an entire school of international relations theory called Wellsianism, long buried by history because it was buried by the advent of World War II, which ended that period of hope in international thinking. But H.G. Wells strongly believed that the future of Europe and the future of the world was countries pooling their sovereignty and building collective tools and institutions that would allow us to transcend the conditions that led to global conflict. And one of those predictions involved this thing, the world brain. It was, as he imagined, what he called a permanent, synthetic, universally accessible and relevant resource which would capture all the world's information. And in his mind, This was literally something that would be something like an encyclopedia, a massive library of humanity that would be an international institution staffed by a civil service composed of the world's brightest men and women, and they would literally try to compile all the world's information and keep it up to date and share it with everyone. And for him, that wasn't just an interesting project which would help archive things. It was something that would play an incredible role in changing the nature of relations between countries and cultures and communities. When countries all were able to collaborate on building that resource and having access to that shared resource of humanity's knowledge, he thought it would lessen the foundations of conflict that right now were obviously fueling massive chaos in his life. Well, the great thing is, of course, what was in his work of zany science fiction, futuristic gazing, ended up being the reality that we now have today. The world brain exists, it is the internet. And I take great solace in the fact that we now have 3.6 billion people online. In the year 2000, there were only just over 1 billion people online, almost entirely in Western Europe and the United States. Now, the internet is truly a global resource and growing exponentially. We have more than 2.2 billion people on Facebook and hundreds of millions of people using other online resources and communities and tools. We have created something that was once the dream of the science fiction futurists, and it is now our everyday reality. The lesson there for us, I think, is quite simple. In spite of all the massive challenges, in spite of all the fears and concerns, which are completely legitimate, that we have about new technology, let us not lose sight of the fact that we have built something incredible that was once the dream of our ancestors, and it is an incredibly precious and rare resource. And nothing about the internet and its future is guaranteed. We take it for granted every day, but I assure you that there are plenty of threats and challenges out there, and we'll talk more about those in the Q&A, I'm sure, which threaten the future of that world brain. With a world brain, we have the ability to communicate instantly, to connect with people, to power businesses, to build shared empathy and understanding of our common global challenges. It is an incredible resource, and we should not start from a position of being natural skeptics. However, that brings me to my second work of science fiction, which I'm sure many of you will have read, even if you don't consider yourself science fiction fans, and that's Frankenstein, the first work of science fiction, in many people's estimation, written in 1818 by Mary Shelley. Now, all of you will be familiar with the story of Frankenstein and the monster that he created. It's interesting, actually, that we put so much attention on Frankenstein, who was in fact not the monster, it was the creator of that monster. And people often refer to that monster, the sort of caricature with the bolt in his neck, lurching around, being chased out of town by villagers with pitchforks and torches, and we say, Frankenstein. No, it wasn't. Frankenstein was the creator, the irresponsible creator who stitched together a bunch of different people to create his automaton and attempt at making human life. But in reality, Frankenstein's monster, the creature, was actually truly an amazing invention. It was something that genuinely created life where there was none before. It was a creature who turned out to be fairly enlightened. While living out his early days crouched behind a coal shed in a forest in the middle of winter, this was a creature who was reading Virgil's epics and trying to learn what is it like to be a fully functioning member of human civilization. And it was actually people who chased him out of town with their pitchforks and torches and denied him a place within that society. There is a natural inclination of all of us in every generation to fear new technology and to fear the unknown, and that is exactly why the monster was raced out of town by that mob of angry villagers. And in a way, the internet has now become our Frankenstein's monster. It is a thing that inspires terror, even when there is no terror to be found. We have created fear where there is no fear, and we have taken real challenges which do exist and turned them into sensationalist existential questions about the future of our society. Now, that is not to deny that those questions do not exist. We face enormous challenges, and we've been hearing about them for the last day and a bit at this summit. We must deal with those. But the internet is not the source of all our problems in the world. It is not the solution to all the problems in the world, and it is not a monster that we should race out to murder with our pitchforks and torches. And actually, one of my favorite things, if you are looking for some non-fiction from a previous age to read, this will almost look like science fiction to you. Go and find a medical encyclopedia from the 19th century, because after the steam engine was created, one of the first new ailments that was added to the Oxford Dictionary of Medical Ailments was something called train sickness. There was a belief that humans and the human body were not equipped to go any faster than 15 miles an hour, because if you did, you would start hallucinating and you would probably faint. And they believed in this dictionary, this was amazing, a perfect reflection of the sexist Victorian society we lived in. It was believed that train sickness particularly afflicted women. So that was an example of the height of medical non-fiction thinking about technology in the 19th century. So you might have done much better in those days to have simply read Frankenstein. My third work of science fiction, and this is one that I have recommended to many, many people. It is on the reading list now for Facebook executives. It is on the reading list for NASA astronauts, and it is on the reading list for at least some portion of West Point Military Academy cadets in the United States. It is a book called Red Mars, which is the first in a trilogy of books, the Mars trilogy, by a Californian science fiction author, Kim Stanley Robinson. Now, he wrote this epic trilogy, which depicts the next 500 years of a purported colonization of Mars, starting in the 1980s with the birth of our astronauts, millennials, who then take to the stars and go and build a new society on our neighboring planet. And what happens is, like all good science fiction, actually an incredible reflection of the world as it is today and the challenges that we face now, extrapolated into a potential vision of the future. We go to Mars, and very quickly national interests and commercial interests become the main driving force of many of the different leaders in that colony. And instead of building this utopian scientific colony and building a new world, we end up fighting the wars of old on Earth and on Mars and competing for the resources that we face up there. And Mars actually becomes the trigger in a much larger global conflict. And the lesson there, which I think we forget so many times, and we hear this all the time in every debate, from fake news to artificial intelligence, technology does not make us better than who we are. Technology is a reflection of society in all its glory and in all its ugliness. There are too many people out there who say, why doesn't technology have a bigger role to play in making people care about the migration crisis? Why doesn't technology make people more understanding of other cultures and communities? Well, actually, I think it does have a huge role to play in both those things. But there are also a lot of people in the world who are riven by nationalism and sectarianism and by divisions that exist deeply within our societies. Why should we expect that technology can erase those divisions so simply when they've been built into our civilization for centuries or millennia in many cases? When we think about fake news, yes, there is a fake news problem online. There is an avalanche of disinformation that has emerged on many different platforms, and it is a shared challenge for the industry that entrepreneurs and innovators are taking incredibly seriously. But humans like fake news. Long before the internet was created, I assure you, the Daily Mail and Fox News existed. And they will continue to exist long after we've stopped talking about fake news all the time. People like to spread rumors. People like to spread conspiracy theories. Yes, we can come up with algorithmic solutions which reduce the torrent of disinformation. We can come up with ways to help you better control your information and to try and mitigate the challenges caused by fake news. But I assure you, no tech company created the swirling constellation of social and economic and political crises in our countries. They did not create the failures of globalization that have led an entire generation to be incredibly angry about the world and about the dysfunctional elites and institutions that they too often feel do not represent them and do not hear their voices. There is a reason there are people who are angry enough to want to share fake news and to believe in it in the first place. And as far as I know, in science fiction or fiction, there is no company in Silicon Valley that has invented a special machine in its basement which forces people to believe anything they see online. People are believing in fake news for a reason, and to solve that, we must go to the source of it, which is the social and economic and political problems in our societies that it's up to all of us working with the industry to go and solve. My fourth work of fiction, this one is utterly zany, but it's a fantastic read. It's called The Sparrow. It's written by an author, Mary Doriah Russell, written in 1996. It depicts a future where a set of scientists in South America who are funded by the Jesuit church end up intercepting a signal from outer space. And they discover they have found the first contact from aliens. They've received a message from a distant planet. And without the knowledge of any other world governments, they quickly construct a spaceship and they go off to that planet to see if they can make first contact with the aliens and potentially convert them to Christianity. It's a fascinating read. It's actually a very thoughtful work that looks at theological concepts and how those would actually evolve in a future where we did make contact with another race. But this is the interesting lesson here. We're all laughing about this idea, aliens and Earth. Well, my favorite part of that book is the morning after they discover that the spaceship has left for this planet and the United Nations has to sit down and actually work out what the hell to do about this. When I was at the UN, many years before I was at Facebook, I was in this little office in the Chrysler building. They were renovating the UN at the time, so we all got exiled to different real estate locations around Manhattan. And next door to me was this office of three gentlemen who were the absolute most eccentric-looking people I'd ever encountered. They were from the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. If there's anybody from that office here today, I apologize. I really did admire your fashion sense. There was an office at the UN, which it was rumored, nobody knew what the heck this office actually did on a day-to-day basis, that they had actually come up with a protocol of what would happen if the nation states of the world did receive a first contact from aliens. Now, we're probably not going to be called upon to craft a response to aliens in our lifetime. You are probably not going to have to be sitting in the General Assembly Hall or in the European Parliament thinking, what do we send those aliens? On the other hand, we are going to be called upon to make really crazy decisions about things that right now seem utterly ludicrous. And some of the things that I think about are particularly around robotics and AI. The consumer robotics industry, the household robots that you remember seeing from science fiction movies from the 1980s onwards, they are about to become a huge reality in our lives in the coming decades. The consumer robotics industry is expected to be worth about $20 billion in just the next 2 years. In Japan right now, they are testing caregiver robots in more than 5,000 senior citizen homes around the country in a population which has a very rapidly aging segment of that population. Using robotics to help care for those citizens is an important part of the Japanese government's social security strategy for the coming years. And when you think about the exponential growth of all the technologies that have powered everything from our smartphones to simply the growth of those global services like Facebook and Google and YouTube, all of those are expected to continue growing exponentially over the coming years. Graphics capability is going to grow by about 1,000x in the next 10 years. Moore's Law, which is the sort of foundation of all the progress we've made as a tech industry over the last few decades. It's a concept coined by Gordon Moore, the former founder of Intel, who said that microchip processing power basically doubles every 18 months or so. That is expected to continue holding true for many years to come. And that means the devices in our pockets are going to grow more powerful, and the tools that we are going to use are going to become even more complex and far-reaching in their effects on society. So all of us should expect that we have many more decisions to make about these futures, and what we have seen so far is nothing compared to that future. My last story is one called Ender's Game, and this one's particularly close to my heart because I had to read this entire series. Ender's Game is one of Mark Zuckerberg's favorite books. So when I worked with him, I rapidly consumed every source of knowledge and inspiration for the man so I could try and get inside his head. And it turned out to be a fascinating read. Again, a zany future where aliens have attacked Earth and human civilization is facing a devastating conflict, not unlike many other science fiction tropes. What made this interesting, though, was less for me what happens with our war against the aliens, which probably won't happen anytime soon. It was instead what happens on Earth. While this alien threat arrives, the nations of the Earth very quickly end up pooling their resources to confront that external threat, And in the aftermath of the war, when national interests and allegiances and rivalries start rearing their ugly heads again, it is a group of young people using what, in this story written in 1985, predicted would become the World Wide Web. They use the World Wide Web to galvanize citizens to stand up against military dictatorship and to forge a new kind of world order, a pan-global order of nation-states who are able to stand up for peace and security. Something that does not look unlike what is today the European Union. Science fiction has always been deeply rooted in the concepts of internationalism. It has always been a place where futures have been depicted that show what a European order would look like if it was at greater global scale. There is a reason that in every single science fiction depiction of the far-flung future, humanity has always united under some sort of world authority. We are a tiny planet. We're a tiny continent in spite of how big we may think we are, and we face enormous global challenges together. Science fiction is very, very good at depicting what those existential threats to our planet may look like, often much, much better than the non-fiction sources that we read. We should never lose sight of the fact that technology is doing something extraordinary to transform our identities, our connections, our communities, which right now extend to planetary scale. And I want to close, just before we do Q&A, by telling you a little fiction story, or non-fiction story, I should say, about myself. It sounds like fiction when I think back on it because it's so ludicrous. In the 1980s and the 1990s, when I was growing up in the UK, my family was the only non-white family in our town. We lived in this tiny little village near Heathrow Airport called Sunbury-on-Thames. The village no longer exists. It's been absorbed into London proper. It is now just an ugly cityscape. But back then, when I or my family walked down the street, people would point and they'd say, "Who's that?" And people in school would say, "Do you speak Chinese or do you speak Japanese?" And I'd say, "I have absolutely no idea. I speak English. I've never even been to China or Japan. And my mother's from Malaysia. And my dad's from Burma. So you tell me, which one do you think I speak?" That was the ludicrous world of just a few decades ago. And I think now to the world we live in today, and Britain, in spite of Brexit, 100% more cosmopolitan, 100% more diverse, a country where people don't ask me anymore, "Do you speak Chinese or Japanese?" They instead ask me, "Do I feel British or do I feel something else?" And as a kid, whenever people asked me where I was from, I always used to annoy them by saying, "I'm European." Because if they weren't going to accept me for being British or being English, well, then I was damn well going to put myself in another bucket. And trust me, there was no way that annoyed kids as much as saying you were European in late 90s England. The science fiction future has already arrived in our own lives. It has already transformed our realities extraordinarily in the last few decades, driven by many of the other social and economic transformations that we have seen in the world. And it will continue to do so. Our children will face completely new challenges and completely new lives. Let us embrace the technologies that are coming, but let us also recognize the challenges as they are, not as the phantom fears that really do belong in a science fiction future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dex. We have less than 8 minutes for Q&A, so I would like to kindly ask you to keep your questions straight to the point and no more than 30 seconds. And I will ask Dex to keep it to maximum to a minute each answer. We have mics in the back. Okay, we take 2 questions at a time, one in the back and one in the front.
I'm Lano from a think tank in Brussels. You haven't mentioned one very important piece of science fiction which many people in this room have read, and which is important for what you said. Orwell, 1994,
Sure.
Big Brother. Because I wanted to say this because of the concern which is extremely strong in Europe today for privacy. And we are monitored all the time. So these developments which you sketched, watch us all the time. And many people are just fed up with it. And that's why we have this GDPR in Europe now.
Sure.
So don't underestimate certain tendencies which will kind of stop or try to undermine. Also, the competition commissioner was here yesterday, let's say from a competition perspective, monopolies, which will stop what is going on. And which will, also because, we have the big brother emerging.
Sure, what was your question?
My question is, let's say, let's say that is could be a big impediment to what you described.
Yeah, I don't think it's an impediment. I think it's a challenge that we have to manage. Nobody is saying that in a world where technology presents enormous opportunities for humanity, that there aren't also massive challenges to deal with. And a simple glance for the headlines on any given day shows all the problems that tech companies are going through. I work on helping to solve some of those problems, and I have done for the last decade. We will face more of them. Technology is not perfect, and it does not present us with some future utopia. It reflects humanity in all its ugliness, as I said. And these are the kinds of problems we absolutely must deal with. It is completely legitimate to focus on privacy. It is very important, and I think Europe has played an enormous constructive role in advocating for the rights of users and citizens online. But we must also remember while we're doing that, not to become so far removed from our understanding of those opportunities that we start thinking that technology is automatically evil, or it's a thing that we have to shove back into the box. It is a tool that we must manage, and tools are neither evil nor good innately. They are simply there to be used and crafted for our own ends.
Please, go ahead.
Alan Gusko, Globsec. I want to add yet another book to your list, and the authors that you mentioned previously were mostly from the Western world, but even though they, of course, have global messages. What I want to add is the book that proves that Central Europe can also contribute to the global messages, and that's the Karel Čapek. I'm not sure whether you heard about them, but
No.
that's wonderful. He's a Czech author.
We can swap reading lists after this.
Yeah, he actually invented the word robot 100 years ago. So it shows that already for 100 years, Central Europe has been thinking about all these issues, but nobody knows about it in the West. The question to you as a communication expert, what kind of message should Central Europe develop to make sure that the world hears about it and its technological aspirations?
Well, I think there are an incredible number of amazing startups. I see the gentleman behind you has already put his hand up who is involved in one of those startups, and we had a great conversation yesterday about what he's working on. There are incredible startups that are emerging in communities and hubs all over Central and Eastern Europe. What I think has been missing is having policymakers and decision makers really tell those stories as part of that same narrative about how we go about solving those technological challenges in the future. All the problems that we're facing, everything from privacy to jobs and AI, all of those things are going to require partnerships between the industry and between government. And it is entrepreneurs who are building those startups, that next generation of services, that are going to be absolutely on the front lines of solving these problems. There are not two separate debates that can go on, one for regulators and policymakers and a separate one where you're building cool things in a garage over in your startup hub. They have to be absolutely joined up. So I would encourage policymakers to really be opening their doors and talking to startups and learning what are the tools that are being developed today that may help solve those challenges of tomorrow. And for entrepreneurs, don't think of what you're doing as being disconnected from those boring discussions that those policymakers are having over in Brussels. I think it's fantastic that there are lots of startup folks in this room and at this event. Really, we should be doing much, much more to create partnerships and collaborations that are meaningful between the two sides.
Okay, we have a question here in the front, and wonder, we start here and we take also lady in the back, so you can get two, and probably the last two questions.
Okay, 3 questions in 30 seconds. What do you think the causality is between fiction turning into non-fiction? Is it fiction laying down the gauntlet to everyday life? Secondly, what do you think the role is of fiction nowadays in addressing these challenges? How do we use that as a tool, as it's inspired, as you said, so many people to work? And I forgot my third question.
We get the third question in the back, and then we will close it. Marek, on the right.
Hi, Oana Popescu, Global Focus Romania. Very briefly, what is the profile of the well-equipped citizen 10 years from now to use the tools that are neither good nor bad for his personal and common good? Well, what are their daily routines? What are their emotional profiles? What are their professional profiles? And most of all, where do they live?
Interesting question. I'll start with that one. Where will citizens who are equipped with these tools live? Everywhere. That's the greatest story of the next wave of internet services. It's actually not even AI or robotics or virtual reality or any of those emerging tech. It is the technology and the tools that all of us take for granted today, the services that we have on our smartphones in our pockets right now, that are going fully global that I think is the most extraordinary thing. Right now, there's 3.6 billion people online, but that means half the planet basically doesn't have access to the internet. Half the planet isn't talking about fake news on Facebook. They've never even heard of Facebook. These are people who are going to become consumers of digital tools and services in the coming years. They are going to make the internet 100% more diverse and extraordinary when we add those voices which have been neglected far too long in many of our other institutions on this planet, when they add their collective voices to that world brain that H.G. Wells talked about. So I think they're going to be everywhere. What people use those tools for, again, will be everything. That's the thing. We're going to face the integration of digital tools into every part of life. And it will actually be, in my opinion, the most mundane applications that will be the most extraordinary. Since I moved back to Europe from the United States 3 months ago, I was in the States for 10 years, I just moved back to the UK, I have been enthralled by noticing the minor cultural differences. When I go to meetings at work, I'm the only person who's typing in a meeting on a laptop. Everyone else is taking notes by hand. And I never understood why so many Europeans do that. Because all it means is that, one, you probably have a bunch of illegible writing afterwards which you can't read and you throw away. Or two, you're going to end up transcribing your notes on your computer later so you can actually make them meaningful and to share them with your colleagues and with anyone else. Why don't you just type on your phone or your computer to start with? That's a minor organizational use of technology, but at scale, it is thousands of organizational tweaks like that which will have huge outputs in terms of productivity. And right now, Europe and the UK certainly have a huge productivity challenge, trying to do more with less, and we should start by thinking, how can we use those very ordinary applications of tech in our everyday lives? Closing off on the questions about fiction.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Whether fiction informs non-fiction or vice versa, I think it's a cross-pollinization. There is a reason that so many entrepreneurs and inventors in Silicon Valley, everyone from Mark Zuckerberg to Elon Musk, thinks deeply about science fiction because it is the best illustrative guide of the science fact of tomorrow. And the one often becomes the other when people see ideas. Google has basically been working for years on trying to build the computer from Starfleet, from Star Trek, and they're making extraordinary progress in doing that. I think, what was your second question? You had a three-parter.
What the role of fiction is going forward?
Yes. Well, I think the role is simply going to be sketching out even more possible futures, and there we have an endless supply of science fiction to choose from, and we can swap some recommendations outside in the hall.
Thank you, Dex. Please join me in thanking Dex for a wonderful Tatra talk. And I would like to welcome on stage for the final panel, Miroslava Germanova, who will moderate the panel on international cooperation in dire strait, private sector to the rescue.
Hi.
Please.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last panel discussion of this year's GlobSec Tatra Summit, which now will be unofficially known as the conference with the most calming view in Europe, I guess. Our last discussion is full of interesting topics. It's not completely easy, but I have very interesting guests that I want to share with you. Please help me welcome to the stage Ms. Tanja Vajnio, the CEO of the tech company ABB Czech Republic. Mr. Miroslav Lajčák, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovak Republic. Mr. Gordon Bajnai, the former Prime Minister of Hungary and now Chairman of the Global Advisory Board at Campbell Lutyens Luton. And Ms. Maitri Sitaraman, journalist and CEO of Faculties Media Limited from London. I think we all agree when I say the best way to do things in the world is to cooperate. But how to do that when there are problems caused by individuals or countries or some politicians who view things differently? That's one of the topics that we'll be talking about, but also we try to incorporate it into a digital world that we're talking about for the whole weekend. And I'm going to start with Mr. Lajčák, who just finished his tenure as the president of the General Assembly at the UN. And multilateral cooperation of states was one of your main topics. But also you've been working out of US, whose president is the one making trouble at the moment. So how is the international cooperation going?
Well, it's not doing very well. Good afternoon, everyone. And I think we have one one error in the topic of this panel, namely we shall remove the question mark. Yes, the international cooperation is in dire straits, and yes, we need the private sector to rescue it. So there is no doubt about it, and there is no question mark here. The international cooperation in general is very much now determined by the tendencies towards unilateralism and also by the attempts to solve issues by force. Economic, but not necessarily even, if needed, also military. And instead of respecting the rules that have been set for a good reason, we see attempts to enforce the views by those who are strong enough and powerful enough to do so. So we have to resist it, and we have to have the assistance from the private sector. There are many examples how to do it or why we have to do it. I can use one that I brought back from New York, which is related to the sustainable development. As you know, back in 2015, the General Assembly adopted an earth-shaking program for this planet, which is called Sustainable Development Agenda, or Agenda 2030, which, if implemented, will really change this planet, make it more livable, and we'll be able to hand it over to the next generation in a better shape. But it does not come for free. It's 17 goals, universal, because for some countries it's the zero hunger, for other countries it's the smart cities. But to implement it, we need 5 to 7 trillion US dollars annually, which represents 7 to 10% of global GDP, or 25 to 40% of annual global investment. We don't have this money, and we will not have this money coming from the state budgets, from official development assistance. So this is a clear example why we need the private sector to step in, not only to fill the gap, but it's also out of selfish interest, because there is no real business without sustainability, without predictable development. So, and what I've seen is that private sector is interested. There is a lot of enthusiasm. There are many good examples, but what is missing is a concrete action, coordinated effort, real partnerships, real policies here. And in order to address this, I organized a high-level event in June on financing for sustainable development. We invited governments, businesses, foundations, philanthropy, financial institutions, regional organizations, trying to address exactly these issues. And yes, the discussion confirmed is that there are enough financial resources, there is enough goodwill, but it's not properly tapped, it's not properly channeled. So lots of efforts with very little concrete results and outcome. So and obviously by inviting the private sector, we must understand that private sector is interested in making profit. Private sector needs safe environment. There is no other way how private sector will enter into the issues and areas we want private sector to be present there. So what we did as a follow-up, and that might be a useful information for the representative of private sector, that after this event in June, I asked all the participants to share with us or to send me their experience, advices, lessons learned. We put it together in a form of a compendium of recommendations, and on 25th of October, I'll officially launch this compendium or the toolbox for private sector, those who are willing to invest into sustainable development. It will happen at the World Investment Forum in Geneva, and the website will be, special dedicated website will be managed and updated by UNCTAD. So we need a partnership between governments, international organizations and private sector, because the role of the governments is to adopt the legislation, to set the goals, and to make it possible and easy for private sector and safe to enter. So this is the only way how I believe we can overcome the dire straits we are currently in.
We also have a representative of the business itself here, Mrs. Vainai. Can you tell us what are the biggest challenges of working with governments on projects for development? You work in a tech company on digitalization, on robots, on sustainable energy. So what projects have you been working on with the public sector maybe? And yes, what problems are you facing today?
Thank you very much for your opening. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm very happy that you brought up the point of sustainable development. Because if we look at the economic growth in the past, it was largely connected with increasing emissions, greater use of natural resource, and I believe we all agree that we need to break it. And I also believe that technology can help us to break that trend. So we talked yesterday a lot about digital technologies, a lot about new technologies making this happening. And I think this is the challenge and the opportunity at the same time. If I start with the opportunity, let's take, for example, transportation. More than 25% of emissions in Europe are caused by transportation. So we need to find, and technology is in a key role in that, we need to find solutions to lower the emissions in the transportation. Whether it's the e-mobility, whether it's the more energy efficient rail solutions, these are all part of the solution, and we had a great panel discussion around this topic yesterday for those of you who attended. And we need corporations like ABB. We were just recently named by Fortune magazine #8 company in the world, changing the world for the better. Now, that said, and coming back to your question about challenge, I think the challenge lies in the same place as the opportunity. The technology and the development of technology is getting faster and faster. And it's also getting easier to use. So we have not only the corporation using these technologies, but also the SMEs. So the whole ecosystem becomes, and the society becomes digital. And I think here we need to find a way to run the dialogue much more effectively than in the past. Because if the train is going faster, 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 and we don't have a mechanism to link the locomotive and the rest of the train with a good enough magnet, I think this conversation and this situation will be exponentially more difficult in the past.
Yes, and we're talking about a sustainable future, sustainable energy maybe, but that's also part of the conversation in Europe recently. We want a green future, we want a sustainable future, but also there are countries who still need to support industries like car industry, like Germany, who is fighting for keeping the diesel cars in motion and things like that. So how, Mr. Baina, maybe you can tell us how the cooperation within European states can work when there are so many different views and ideas and maybe sometimes conflicting attitudes towards big topics like sustainability in the future?
Quite a broad question. Let me start by saying that I think there is a fundamental global rebalancing happening in the world, starting from the economy, but with the emergence of China and in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, with the middle classes in the developed world losing their feel of security, there is a huge geopolitical recession. So the economy is booming, but politics is in recession. There is no clear leadership in the world. There was a world order led by the United States, the Washington Consensus in economics, which we in Central Europe joined in 1990, but the Washington Consensus was there for a long time. The European Union was the closest ally of the United States. Now, with the backlash of globalization and people either losing their job because of globalization or most recently because of technology, very often like in the US, I think it's now much more driven by technology than actual globalization. Middle class is losing their status. Now, it is the middle classes on what you can build a democracy. It was written by Aristotle in the Greek Policies, and ever since, if the middle class gets shaken, then democracy gets shaken. So somebody, Toynbee, a British historian, wrote that revolutions are not made by those who are poor, but by those who get disappointed. And in the follow-up to the financial crisis, our world in Europe and in North America as well is full of disappointed people. Now, how does it answer your question? With this fundamental shift, a country or a region can only keep its role in the world, its current status in the world, if it can remain economically relevant. And the risk for Europe is that it is going down in relevance compared to relatively to China and a still very strong and fastly growing United States. So for us, we have a lot of problems with Europe. We criticize it a lot. We say it's bureaucratic. In Europe, it's a sport for politicians. When something good happens in my country, I did it. If something wrong, then it's Brussels. So but still, for us Europeans, to keep the way we live, to keep our place at the rule-setting table, the European Union is the only chance. And we need to stay relevant in the economic sense. Because if you become weak economically first, then you will become less relevant in foreign policy and military sense. And we have to put this together. So we have to keep this single market as a one big power, and we have to use this single market as a negotiating power towards China, towards the US, in a much stronger way than our naive past we have done. Now, and here comes the answer to your question. Car sector. Europe is the largest car exporter in the world, driven by Germany, but not just Germany, France and others. The number one export market for German cars in the world is the United States. Donald Trump is threatening with tariffs of 25% on those cars. The number two export market for German cars is the United Kingdom. So overall, I can say there is an economic boom in the world, but there is a very strong headwind. Politics rules over the economic rationale since the financial crisis, and the political recession in the world is threatening this economic power of Europe and in global the economic upside.
Okay, so maybe the way to move forward and to build on partnerships is to increase trust of people in politicians, in political decisions, in their leaders, in people who represent them in European Union and in the world. But there's also a crisis of trust building in Europe, in various countries. People stop trusting the institution more and more. We've been talking about this quite a lot in Slovakia recently. But it's an issue in whole Europe. So how to deal with this, how to promote cooperation and communication over national interests, over individualism, over selective egos of different states maybe or different leaders. How to promote this in today's Europe? Maybe you can start and then maybe Maitreyi can pitch in as well if you have an idea.
Europe has a constructional problem. Let's talk openly. Europe was in Europe we always make decisions when there is a crisis, and we usually do the politically easy to sell part of a solution, and we leave behind the unpopular part of the solution. 3 topics I mentioned as an example. We have created a single currency. It was very popular politically, the euro, but we didn't create a fiscal union because it's very difficult politically. It's about the final, the ultimate reason of politics is fiscal policy. How much I take from you and how much I give to you. That's fiscal policy. If you put it to the Brussels level, then nationally elected politicians lose the main topic why they are elected. So that's very difficult to do. But we created the first step, monetary policy, without a fiscal policy. However, it's a hook. You can't pull it out because we bleed to death. Sorry for the picture. If the euro unfolds, Europe will collapse, even those countries who are not in the eurozone. Second such mistake, we have brought down all the borders in Europe, the Schengen Agreement. Great news, I love it. Everybody loves it in the room, I guess. But we forgot to protect our borders from the outside. How can you remain a sovereign without defending and at least controlling your borders? So that was naive. The third such thing, we have created a joint foreign policy. Miroslav can speak about it much more. But we forgot to add a joint defense policy. And all of these, and so it's toothless. So we have all of these 3 decisions are half-baked, half-cooked solutions. And now in the crisis, when the masses are worried of their economic future, their identity, and their physical security, Europe has to find a solution to all these 3 issues. These are the top issues. If we can solve it before the next crisis, then we have a chance to survive. If we don't solve these issues, then the political backlash, the revolution, the rage against not just the machine, but the European machinery will swipe it off. So we don't have much time because the next crisis is coming soon.
So there's a lot of work ahead of politicians in meeting in Brussels regularly. Minister, maybe are you working on it to fix the loopholes that exist in the big European system that might help increase the trust of people in European institution and European project as such? Are you intent on fixing all those?
We are sort of working on it, but not really, because I fully agree with Gordon. We've been through many crises, but I cannot say that we've solved the crisis. We have survived the crisis, but we still left so many painful issues open and unanswered. And right now, instead of focusing on these issues, the issues that our citizens care about and are confronted with, so much of our time and energy is taken by Brexit, lots of it, and the preparation for the next elections, and the beginning of the discussion about the next budget. So internal stuff, institutional stuff. And obviously people are fed up and disappointed because they really want to get answers to the questions about their jobs, about the prospects, about the security, about the protection of borders, about the way how we are going to deal with migration, and let alone the fact that we do not play our global role. We as European Union, we have our global responsibility. We are expected to deliver on our partners in our neighborhood. We don't do that. So, and this is the fertile ground for those whom we label rightly or wrongly as populists or xenophobes or nationalists, because there are so many things to criticize. The second part of the same issue is that they offer no solutions. It's easy to criticize when you ask these people what is the better option, what is your solution. There is no answer. But I really believe that we must be able to give answers to our citizens. There must be no running away from hot issues, and we have to be honest with ourselves, with each other, because we cannot fool our citizens.
It's also true that people like easy answers much more than the complex ones, and that's why the popularity of the alternative political parties is rising, really, not just here in Central Europe, but elsewhere in Europe as well. And current generation of 40, 50-something people in Europe is thinking very differently from their children. That's also part of the problem. The young generation's attitudes are quite different from those of their parents. And these people are exactly the future of Europe. And they like the easy solutions much more than the complex ones, right? And their trust or their interest in European institution is declining because they don't understand it. Nobody is really teaching them about it. So maybe, Ray, do you think talking to young people or education point in all of this is important as well?
I don't agree with you, actually. I don't think that young people don't understand. They are smarter than we give them credit for. I don't think it's about a lack of education. It's about simple communication, and it's also not always as simple as people like a simple message, and that's why they go for it. They go for the only message that's coming through. It's all about talking to people, and the Brussels bubble, as people in Brussels will tell you, exists. That's the world you know. If you work in a company, that's the world you know. You get on with your life, you're making policies, you're investing in X place, that's where your community is going, and you don't see the opportunity in the other place because you're so busy living your life, or running for elections, or talking to people in your own circle. I think the issue simply comes down to how much conversation is actually real. Are we giving people the credit for being smart enough to understand that this is a problem, but this is the benefit? Is the situation as bad as alternative parties are making them out to be? Probably not. If you look at the economy, it is doing better. If you look at employment rates, they are getting better. Are the jobs the same as they were 20 years ago? No, they're not. But is it getting better? The facts tell you they are. The question comes down to, who are we talking to? How are we talking? Are we actually communicating with the idea of listening to actually do something about it, or listening for the heck of listening and then saying, well, we put a panel together, we talk to business, but it's not happening. It comes down to the public-private partnerships that everyone keeps talking about. How do you make it happen? Are we actually listening to ABB saying these are the issues that we're facing as politicians? What can you do to make this work out? And how do you get, as politicians, what do you get from the businesses that are coming in? All of that then trickles down to your individual employee, who is also a voter, a citizen. They're not silly. They're smart people. All they need is information flow that's clear, consistent, and fair. Simplicity is, I think, overrated. People are smarter than we give them credit for. Young people are especially smarter than we give them credit for. They are second generation into the fourth industrial revolution. These are people who, sometimes I look at babies and I think they're born with smartphones in their hands or tablets in their hands, things that I would never have thought of when I was a child. These are children who know the benefits and the pitfalls of social media. Their behavior is different to the millennials. What we're not giving credit is the next generation of voters, who will be also employees, who will also be investors. They are smarter. So the question is, are you actually all talking with the purpose of listening and doing, or for the sake of just putting a panel together? I think that's it.
Maybe that brings us to business responsibility as well, of educating people who work for you and work with you. Are you working on that as well?
Absolutely, on multiple frames. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm going to answer it from two angles, from the future employees and from the current employees. I think when we talk about education, it's no longer that we go to university and we have a degree and then we work in one occupation the whole of our lives, like our mothers and fathers did. So a lot of the education is actually re-qualification when the processes change, when the jobs change, when part of it gets simplified, automized, and most of the cases for the better. We are automating jobs and tasks that are dangerous for people, that are potentially too difficult, that are potentially very dull. And then we are upgrading them in the most cases, if you look at the statistics, to the jobs that are safer, they are better paid, they are more value add. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I think it needs this dialogue. And also, it's not only a tech problem, it's a problem a lot of times with the change management. So the role of HR department is extremely important, so that people understand why we are doing this, what's the purpose in this, and what's in there for that. And I think all of us in the business, as managing our companies, we know the importance of change management. And it's nothing else than change management and leadership. Then when we talk about the young generation, so I have 3 daughters, so I don't think they are stupid. So I think they're extremely smart. So I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we all have children and we know they're very smart. But one of the things that struck me yesterday when there were talks about education, because there were talks about education and innovation. What I wanted to hear more, or what I wished I would have heard more, is the education in STEM and engineering. Because if we think about innovation, and some of the talks were, how do we bring the tech companies, what are the tech companies of Europe? Where do they come from? They don't come from social sciences or other fields. They come from mathematics, physics, STEM, engineering. I was fortunate enough myself. I went to MIT. I graduated from MIT both in business and in engineering 14 years ago. Guess what? My classmates, my alumni, are the one who runs these companies: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. These are the engineers that come from MIT and other schools. So if we neglect the importance of engineering, the basic math, what is artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence is nothing else than mathematic algorithms. Mathematic algorithms. So if we neglect the importance of the training in Europe, I think it will be extremely and exponentially difficult for us to create those Googles and Amazons and Apples and Facebooks. So here I wish that we inspire the young people to study these fields, because what you said is about how do we communicate. And many times mathematics and sciences are perceived boring. Oh, these are these people who work in the corner and they don't ever talk to other people. You know, when I went to engineering school, they were like, are you crazy? Are you nuts? Will you sit in the corner? You will never talk to anyone. So I think this is the perception that we have to change in the young generation. And just to give you a flavor of what businesses must do and should do, and I'm proud that what, for example, we do in Czech Republic as ABB, I'm sure that many of you know the film festival in Zlín for kids. This is an event, 5 days for kids' movies. So what we do is we bring robotics. We bring different sort of robotics to inspire young boys and girls about robotics. Because I think the young people, they need to understand what's behind the mathematics. What are they going to be actually doing? What are the jobs? They will be working for Google. They will be designing the next Apple Watch. And I think this is the role that we businesses have to do, because we have the applications, we have the role models, we have this all cool, exciting stuff, and we need more and more to find a way to bring that school stuff to the young boys and girls, so that they actually enter and say that I want to study in VUT Brno, I want to study in CVUT in Prague, or I want to study in the Technical University of Žilina. This is where I believe that the businesses have a lot to do moving forward, and looking forward, signing up for it.
Yes, Mr. Minister?
This is an excellent example of why the governments and private businesses need each other. I was in Ukraine yesterday, in Kharkiv. I visited a company which is called FED, which is an abbreviation of Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky. But they, But they have like 3,000 plus employees. 90% of them are university educated IT experts. I was amazed when I saw that. And then we have the data from OECD that are saying that 31% of jobs globally will be changed significantly within the next 15 to 20 years, and 14% of jobs will disappear due to automation. By the way, in Slovakia, it's 40%. So globally 14, in this country it's 40. So the question is, how do we adjust the system of education so that we educate people who are ready to do the jobs of tomorrow? How would the government know if it's not from the business sector? If you don't tell us how you see your business 15, 20 years from now, what kind of professions you will need? So, and this is, we simply cannot exist side by side. We need to communicate, we need to formulate the vision for the future, otherwise we will lose the global competitiveness battle.
And you are the one who created the vision in the UN, and you're talking about multilateral cooperation with businesses in the world. But how about back at home, at the national level? You're a member of the government. I know you're in the foreign department, so you're not dealing with national issues often. But still, are you working on promoting this kind of cooperation, communication, so it becomes something concrete, not just panel discussion, not just words and meetings?
Well, I think this is what makes the difference, whether the governments think about the next elections or whether they think about the next generations. And obviously, to prepare for the next generations, you have to win the next elections, but you have to be able to combine. You have to be able to define what makes you stronger, what's your competitive advantage. And there are countries like Finland, for example, with education system or research and development, and there are many others. What makes me optimistic here in Slovakia is the way how we have approached exactly the 2030 agenda's implementation. So we put together everyone who is relevant from government sector, from business sector, from academia, from NGO sector, because I see this national 2030 strategy as an overall umbrella which hovers above everything we are going to do in next years. How to fit it, to define what are the niches for this country, where is our competitiveness, where is our comparative advantage, and how are we going to get there. So it's good that there is a strategy, it's good that there is a platform, and I really hope that we will be able to get there.
Maitreyi, if you're looking at all the projects and partnerships in Europe, on businesses, on the way things are going with cooperation between states, are you optimistic that these plans might come into action soon? Are you seeing the improvements yet somewhere?
Well, I'm just a journalist, so observation is all I can offer. And it's been an interesting decade in Europe for me, because I think Angel Gurria has a very famous quote that he uses. I mean, Europe takes its time. You can't accuse them of being fast, but you get there in the end. Am I optimistic? Yes, but unfortunately, something's changed in the last decade or so, and that is the technology factor. There is nothing called a tech company anymore. Everybody's a tech company. Whether you're in banking or you are in engineering, you're a tech company. You're a car company, you're a tech company. The speed at which that's moving doesn't allow the complacency that you can take 3 years to show a great investment from the FC plan. There's no project to show. So what do you, I mean, this is a great example. I film a show called Real Economy. And I remember when FC came out, it was debated, 350 billion, the leverage ratio was talked about in not such kind words. And then you kind of go, okay, proof will be in the pudding. When will we see a project? So we have one studio interview, first year. Second year, another studio interview. Can we see a project? No, we'll bring in some experts to talk about it. Third year, the excitement level, we can actually film something to show people how this leverage ratio actually works on the ground. Now, we can debate whether it works or not, because he's in a better position, because Gordon actually has to decide where to invest that money. But the issue was it took 3 years for us to show European citizens what that money was actually doing. 3 years is not bad. There are situations where you have policies, and in Brussels there's almost a language of when you call a directive, it just goes on, and we all know about it. I think the thing is we don't have that time for complacency and the time to let decisions go around and round in circles, 27 parliaments now from next year. I think that time is gone where we can sit back, say, we'll talk about it, we'll discuss it some more, and then keep negotiating and take 10 years to come to a decision. That's what allows young people or citizens of any age to get frustrated and then go, well, there's no jobs.
Mr. Bajnán, you agree it takes too much time?
Did I put you on the spot?
Two comments. First, reflecting on this and then going back to the labor force issue. So EFSI, the European Fund for Strategic Investments, have so far approved projects of 335 billion euros. Obviously, when this decision is made, it takes years by the time it's getting built. But there are 335 billion euros worth of projects to be shown, communicated, and explained. Yeah. And what I think the European Union institutions are weakest at, there are many weaknesses, but what they're weakest at is communication. If you read the lingo of you can't understand a word.
It's not in any language.
And then, and interestingly, some very talented politicians, when they get to land a job in Brussels, they completely forget to speak understandably. And that's a disaster. The underlying factor goes back to the fact that in national politics, you have a very clear relationship between the voter and the elected politician, and that's a very clear legitimacy. In Brussels, there's an indirect legitimacy, and it's very difficult to balance between the 27 or 28 member states and the level of, it's not only PC, it's a kind of European correctness or whatever, it's a whitewashed empty language. And you don't, and that's why there's a huge, partly that's why there is no European political arena. There are national political arenas, but most of the people don't feel themselves European. First, that's completely correct. First of all, I'm Hungarian. But second, I feel myself European. And we have a lot of debates between us, between Italians and Germans and Greeks and Finns. But when we face the threat of an emerging China or the US, which starts to see Europe as a competitor and not as an ally, then suddenly we realize how much in common we have between us. But the political structure, the legitimacy structure is not there. And the integration will need to continue to go ahead. Otherwise, otherwise Europe will become from a current rule setter to a rule taker, and rules will be set by China and the US without us, and we will lose our European way of life, and we will be poor relative to the other parts of the world if it happens. So there has to be some reasonable integration at the right points, but to achieve that, we need to create legitimacy at the European level, not just at the national level. And that's the biggest crisis of Europe at the moment, because Europe is a political project, not an economic project. The euro is a political project and not an economic project. I was not worried in the Greek crisis. I said, I was teaching at Columbia in New York. My students asked me, oh, the euro is going to collapse next week. Don't worry, I told them. It's a political project. Whatever it takes, it will be saved. Now I'm much more worried, because the political will behind the whole European construct is questioned, and not just in the periphery, in core countries, in Germany and elsewhere. And every country has their own special kind of populism, very different. Yes. But the second comment, completely different, going back to the labor. Do I have time for that?
We should go to questions maybe. So sure. If you could connect it to one of your answers, maybe you can come back to that.
I'm very good at answering what I want to.
Do we have some questions so we can move to those? Yes?
Good afternoon, Nadia Kovalchikova from the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Brussels. My question is to Minister, His Excellency Lajčák. You're the Minister of European and Foreign Affairs. You represent us, the Slovak Republic, in Brussels at NATO ministerials, European ministerials. And my question is very concrete about the topic we actually, I think, should be discussing here and are not talking about it, is the international cooperation in dire straits, which NATO's operation of the Ocean Shield, the Europeans' Atalanta. And my question is about the position of the Slovak Republic and your concrete contribution in these conversations during the ministerials. And what is the position that you raise within these international issues where Slovak country has a seat of a consensus or not? What do you say about these issues? What is the Slovak position about cooperation on piracy, on this kind of far-away international problems? Thank you.
Well, it's not necessarily a question related to the topic of this panel, but I can answer by saying that there are many issues where we are rightly critical when it comes to the European Union current policies, but the defense cooperation and security cooperation is not among them. I really commend that the European Union recognized the need in these global circumstances to strengthen its role, its standing as a security provider and increase its relevance in that respect. And we have a concrete reflection of this, which is called PESCO. Slovakia is part of it. Our position here is very clear. We are supporting it as an exercise complementing and supporting NATO. So we don't want to see this as a parallel track to NATO. We don't think we can afford it. We don't think it makes sense. When it comes to NATO, again, Slovakia, we are a country of 5 million inhabitants, so we believe in system, we believe in partnerships, we believe in multilateralism, because this is what makes us stronger. Any other global order would work against us. So therefore, we want to see a strong EU, we want to see strong NATO, and we want to contribute to it. And when it comes to NATO, we are on the safe ground here because we are, well, our defense budget 2020 will be doubled compared to 2014, from 800 million to 1.6 billion euros. We are modernizing our defense system and westernizing, and you are well familiar with the facts here. So we are doing our part of it, and at the same time making sure that when we meet and when we discuss, there is an outcome, there is an action, there is an understanding, which is not always the case, but this is what we believe we should be doing.
Another question, please.
University of York. There was a lot said about simple and simplistic solutions to complex problems. And the problem I see here is twofold. One, if we try to dumb down the message that we convey to our citizens, we're basically essentially racing to the bottom. And the second problem is that we assume that the political elites have a complex solution to the complex problem. And I think it's a problematic premise. And if you actually look at some of the conspiracy theories that are spun around, they are incredibly complex explanations to very simple things. I mean, if you look at the migration crisis and the conspiracy theories behind it, I mean, with Soros and the Jewish lobby bringing, migrants from the Middle East to, I don't know, destabilize Europe and so on, it clearly shows that people have rejected simple explanations and are searching for whatever they could find, even if it's very complex, to try to make sense of the situation. So, and Minister Lajčák said very well that basically we are trying to survive the crisis rather than solve it. So, for instance, the economic crisis was presented in very simplistic terms with very simplistic solutions, like austerity. It's the simplistic solution par excellence. And I think the question here would be not how to dumb down the message to convey it to the citizens, but how to open channels between decision makers and the citizens, where the citizens can contribute the ideas, where the civil society can input and actually contribute to making complex solutions to complex problems. What would those channels and possibilities be?
Maybe Mr. Bajnai, do you have an idea?
You keep getting put in tough spots.
I'll do my best. So I think there is a huge challenge of communication, which is partly coming from technology. 20, 30 years ago, each of our countries had 1 or 2 TV channels, 3. You had TV1, TV2, whatever it was called, ABC, NBC, and CBS in the US, etc., etc. And this, I'm not talking about the communist era, that's in our country, there was one. But these TV channels and mass media was edited by highly educated centrists, center-right, center-left centrist people who were part of the status quo. Today there are so many channels of communication that you can spend your whole life communicating in a close circle of similar-minded people, echoing and reinforcing each other's views. And in the previous presentation, we talked about how technology is not good or bad, it's just a tool. It seems that many of the bad guys are smarter using technology than the good guys. And also there is an asymmetric war. People who want to stick to the rules of political correctness and factual communication are disadvantaged against those partisans who play the asymmetric game and they don't care about the rules because they have some different perspectives. So in that respect, I would urge all ourselves to find a solution to this, because unless the whole financial crisis and the subsequent crisis management has completely eaten up the political reserve behind the status quo in the world. And if the next crisis comes, that political reserve won't be there, and then it will be very ugly. So we need to find a very quick solution to communicate the most important message to European people: think about what you have to lose. when you look at alternatives and choose only alternatives which don't risk what you have and which allow you to continue to develop. Because we have achieved, this is probably the best part of the world to live in, no when there's so many countries want to join the European Union. But we can disrupt it. Our history books are full of momentary lapses of reason. Think about the First World War, and you know what I mean, think of.
One sentence, if I may, again, agreeing with Gordon, but first, there are no simple solutions to complex problems, but at the same time, the complex solution do not have to be explained in a complex language. So the language should be simple. If we are unable to explain what we do to our citizens in a way they will understand, then they will not support, they will not follow, and this is what is happening. So as complex as our policies might be, we must be able to explain it, to deliver the message in a simple language.
And the same applies for industry. Because if you look at this region, Czech Republic, 1/3 of the jobs in industry, more than 30% cross value add coming from industry. Slovakia is not too different, Hungary moving in that direction. And when I meet especially the SMEs, who should be the growth engine of the industry, and at the end of the day we are looking for growth, we are looking for a better future, and this comes with growth and jobs. We in the industry must find a language to explain what is digitalization, what is artificial intelligence, what is Industry 4.0. Because at the moment, and we need to bring, we like ABB, we need to bring simple solutions that are applicable also for SMEs, and this is really what we are working, making really digital as simple as possible, so that it's not only few companies in Czech, in Slovak and Poland who can use digital technologies. We need to make them simple, we need to make them easy to use, so that also the SMEs can start using digital technologies and can start growing and competing on a global market. And this is what I see dealing with our customers. This is where I feel a lot of responsibility. Also happy to work for a company who has these solutions. So looking forward, I think the future is very optimistic on this side, from the industry point of view.
Thank you very much. And do we have maybe one last question or two? Okay, it seems that yeah, okay, go ahead.
Anton Ondrej from Kia Motors Slovakia. I am admin vice president, and I'm responsible also for HR. And I would like to ask Gordon Barnay about, I think you wanted to speak about labor, right? So if you could answer.
Thank you. I buy you a beer afterwards. No, there was just one comment I wanted to make. Talking from the Central European perspective, our biggest problem at the moment is brain drain and shortage of labor. We had masses of unemployment problems in the face of the financial crisis and before. Still, there are pockets of unemployment in the least educated parts of the population, but overall, the biggest challenge looking forward is the shortage of labor, which will unless we can do something about it, it will slow down our growth potential. And that shortage of labor is primarily driven by loss of manpower to the West. There is the internal migration in Europe. We are losing, just talking about Hungary, we lost roughly 5 to 6% of the total population went to work abroad, most of them in the last 8-10 years since the crisis. We lost, but that 5% of the population is concentrated on the age groups between 18 and say 35-40. So this is the young people who are the most educated, the most talented, or the most entrepreneurial, even if they are not educated, who are ready to go abroad. They work there. They are the most fertile, obviously. That's the age when you have children. Mm-hmm. So talking about ourselves, but the problem is similar in Slovakia and Czech Republic, as I understand, to a degree in Poland. I mean, there are 1 million Poles just living in the UK. So that's a demographic catastrophe. In a pay-as-you-go system, who is going to pay for the pensions if these people remain abroad? Who is going to deliver those babies who keep the population stable? And shorter term, who is going to work in these factories? There is another thing now. On the other hand, with technological change, if our education system doesn't adapt, if you look at previous industrial revolutions, economists will tell you oh, there's no problem. New technologies always created new jobs. Yes, that's true. But there was always a 30, 50-year lag between those new jobs were created. That means 2 generations who are not highly educated going down the drain and making a political revolution unless we do something about it. So education and adult education is key.
I'm really sorry to cut you short again, but we need
Sorry to be so long.
we need to close our discussion, and I'm very grateful to you all for all your interesting inputs. Thank you for coming and for talking to us. And now I'd like to welcome the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, Mr. Vasil Hudak, who will say some final remarks.
Dear Minister, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I'm supposed to give some kind of summary of what we have discussed during this 1.5 days, which I think is an impossible task because, as you know, we had so many topics, so many rich discussions, both official and unofficial. And maybe sometimes these informal, unofficial discussions in the corridors among small groups of people, individuals, are even maybe more important than what is happening in the official discussions. So very difficult task, but I'll try to at least maybe give you some ideas what I believe could be the summary of the discussions and what we have achieved. So this was the 7th Tatra Summit conference. 2 were in Tatras, including this one in Brussels, and 4 in Bratislava. So we started this new history of Tatra Summit last year. This time, as we said yesterday, this time is wonderful weather, beautiful skyline behind us. And I think the fact that you stayed in these discussions and were present, and we had so many people in different seminars and forums, shows that actually it was a good content, that you stayed here and didn't go to the mountains, which of course we are sorry about, but hopefully in the afternoon and tomorrow you'll be able to do it. This year we focused on innovation, and innovation as the key element of economic growth in Central Eastern Europe. And I think it was the right topic. We saw that this is really something where Central Eastern Europe can make a difference for Europe and globally, that it can be done, but we need some public policies which have to take place. We have to have cooperation among the countries of the region, and we have to have very strong engagement of private sector. Public sector, governments, national, European level, subnational governments cannot do it simply alone. They need private sector to go together. There was also a discussion about the next EU budget, about how Europe is moving forward and what is the role of the Central Eastern Europe in this process. We were lucky to have 4 finance ministers from the V4 countries and also finance ministers of Germany and France, and I think this discussion showed us what are the different views and also what are maybe the differences in the way how Central European countries, V4, see Europe vis-à-vis Germany and France. But I think in general, at the end, we agreed that Central Europe and V4, although we sometimes get these negative stamps that we are Europeans and we want Europe to prosper. V4 cannot be prosperous and cannot be successful without Europe being successful. And Europe will be as strong as the weakest links are inside Europe. So I think we are interconnected, and this has to be understood this way, and I think this was a very strong message from this discussion. Maybe some more specific takeaways. There was a discussion about regulation and competition. Obviously, regulation is sometimes viewed as a stumbling block, as something that actually reduces the competition. I think there was a clear message that regulations have to be driven by the end outcome, that the consumers of the regulations have to be included in the process of developing such regulations, and especially in the context of innovation, the regulations have to be so-called future-proof regulations. They have to take into account new developments and have to be flexible enough to react to the innovative developments in the future. Europe is facing its own problems, here in V4, but also in general. This is especially the lack of trust of citizens in the leadership, in maybe direction of Europe. We see it in different places, ranging from Italy to Sweden, etc. Of course, migration is a big part of that. And this has to be tackled both at the European level but also at the national level. And I think it was a clear message yesterday from the discussions that has to be tackled in both ways. The future of Eurozone, creation of the European Monetary Union, also important part of the overall topics. We need to complete the banking union. We have to move towards markets, capital markets union, and we have to strengthen Eurozone as the driving element behind the European Union. For CE, digital transformation creates new opportunities. It's a challenge and it is an opportunity. I think Gordon just mentioned the challenges in terms of education, in terms of developing new skills among the young generation of people in the region. And this is something where governments have to work very closely with private sector. We have introduced in Slovakia the so-called dual education concept, which I think has proven to be very effective and important. Still, of course, has to be worked on, but making sure that the students from secondary schools have an opportunity to get practice and to develop also in practical way in companies which are partners for secondary education schools is an important component which we actually borrowed from Germany and from Austria. In Central Europe, we can build on some traditional industries. Car industry was identified as certainly one of the drivers of economic growth in this region, but we all agree that just completing building cars is not enough. For the region to continue to be the place for investments, we have to move from production to innovation. And this means investment in human capital, but it also means bringing innovation into this sector. And I think it was very nice to have this event yesterday when we celebrated and launched the creation of the Slovak Battery Alliance, which is one of the clear demonstrations how Slovakia is moving towards e-mobility and towards incorporating innovation into the car industry. I already spoke about investing in skills and education, certainly important topic and something that we all agreed has to happen. And last but not least, it was clearly, I think, the message from this meeting that public investments should allow for more opportunities to engage private sector. And I think what is good about this Tatra Summit is that we have even more private sector participants from higher levels of different corporates from Central Eastern Europe, but also beyond Central Eastern Europe. And I think this dialogue between public and private is something that makes Tatra Summit very different and special and useful. In terms of tangible deliverables, because you always ask, okay, so you discuss, you meet, etc., it's nice, but so what? Yeah? And I think that we can certainly mention the launch of the Slovak Battery Alliance as something that is very, very clear outcome, and I think something which can also create maybe a model example for other countries of Central Europe. Also, there was a very good discussion with the V4 finance ministers about creation of the V4 investment advisory platform. This is something which can be done together with the European Investment Bank, with the national promotional banks from these countries. And basically it would be an opportunity to have a financial vehicle to support cross-border connectivity among these countries in energy, transport, in digital economy, environment, etc. This cross-border connectivity is something that we are missing. Maybe some numbers. We were followed also by social media. For example, Slovak Battery Alliance announcement had 66,000 Twitter followers. Commissioner Vestager had 10,000 Twitter followers. V4 Declaration, 12,000 Twitter followers. And yesterday on the Facebook, there were 115,000 impressions. So I think good success that we were able to reach out to the broader audience, and I think it makes clear that Tatra Summit is not only in these corridors, but it has actually impact outside. So to finish, I would like to especially thank you, participants, speakers, those who came here and really made this event happen. I would like to thank GlobSec and the GlobSec Tatra Summit people. I think they actually deserve an applause from us, because to put all this together, I think, is a huge task. And I believe I speak on behalf of us, kind of co-founders of this Tatra Summit with Ivan Korčok, Robert Vaš, hopefully myself, that we are looking for the next year Tatra Summit, and have a wonderful afternoon. And looking forward to seeing you again in 1 year. Thank you.